Good afternoon. Let's come back to our gorgeous event. And I have the pleasure to announce Petula Nascimento, who is the Adjunct Secretary of the Special Secretary of Articulation and Monitoring of Civil House. Eu vou falar em português, porque a apresentação dela está em português, eu vou falar em português. Ela é secretária adjunta da Secretaria Especial de Articulação e Monitoramento da Casa Civil da Presidência da República. Ela é economista, tem doutorado em Políticas Públicas, Estratégias e Desenvolvimento pela UFRJ, e ela tem uma longa carreira que passa por vários cargos de chefia. Ela é pesquisadora da Embrapa, portanto, ela é da carreira do setor público desde 2005, foi chefe da assessoria de relações com o Poder Executivo e gestora do PAC na Embrapa agora, em 2024. Ela retornou para a Embrapa para retornar para a Casa Civil, foi de novo requisitada para a Casa Civil para justamente coordenar as ações de desastre. E ela, então, no período anterior, ela teve também uma diretoria, ela foi diretora da Embrapa Solos, durante um período importante, e na Embrapa exerceu várias funções de assessoria da presidência. Então, ela tem esse papel em que ela, ao mesmo tempo, tem uma sólida formação acadêmica e, ao mesmo tempo, é muito requisitada por uma capacidade de articulação invejável e que a caracteriza como importante servidora pública. E hoje ela está na Casa Civil, justamente coordenando os desastres.
Obrigada, professora Ana Célia, obrigada pelo convite de estar aqui moderando esse painel tão importante. Peraí aqui, gente, problema aqui de tecnologia. Bem-vindos a todos aqui, início da tarde, ao nosso painel sobre inovação e resiliência urbana, né? Uma chamada urgente para essa discussão, né, aqui no Sul Global, nesse painel do T20, para que a gente possa pensar ações de inovações usando a inteligência artificial, vários mecanismos e atuações de forma conjunta, né? Hoje, a gente sabe que os centros urbanos do Sul Global sofrem, né, enfrentam uma pressão crescente devido aos eventos climáticos extremos, às mudanças ambientais, aos choques econômicos, aos investimentos em infraestrutura, que são sempre necessários para que a gente enfrente os desafios, né, que os países vêm passando. Nesse contexto, a resiliência urbana, né, ela não é apenas necessária, mas ela também é estratégica. O nosso objetivo, então, aqui é explorar um pouco como que essas tecnologias, como que a inteligência artificial, a internet das coisas, como que essas ferramentas, né, podem nos ajudar a pensar e a planejar e fortalecer mecanismos de um planejamento cada vez mais resiliente, para que a gente dê conta do desenvolvimento socioeconômico sustentável, oferecendo uma infraestrutura urbana, né, preparada e cada vez mais conectada. A gente entende que a cooperação Sul-Sul e a cooperação Norte-Sul, ela é essencial para que a gente possa trocar esses conhecimentos, né, essas práticas que a gente entende que existem e que andam aí numa trajetória, né, de aprendizado. A gente precisa olhar para o que a gente já passou e entender a dimensão do que está vindo pela frente, e porque apenas juntos, né, nós podemos enfrentar esses desafios globais para construir essas cidades sustentáveis e inclusivas. Então, a gente tem aqui um painel de especialistas para discutir esse tema. A gente tem a Pamela Gopal. Cada um aqui vai se apresentar na hora que começar a sua exposição, para a gente dar uma dinâmica mais intensa à mesa. Cada um vai ter 12 minutos, então a gente vai começar aqui com a doutora Pamela. Obrigada.
Obrigada, thank you. So I am Pamela Gopal, and I am from the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, based in South Africa. I have been involved in the T20 and the G20 space, particularly active over the past 2 years, and a lot of the items also being carried forward from the Indonesia presidency. I'm really happy to be here, and I think that although we might be small in number, I think it's important that the quality of the knowledge that we disseminate is important so that we can take the work forward. First, I want to use this, and just a little bit about me. I am started as a senior policy officer working for the chief executive officer for over 13 years in the Institute. I am there now for 18 years, and I currently run a program called the Policy Bridge Tank, where we bridge knowledge information from our think tanks and academia to policymakers. And I'm happy to announce that the African Union, now that it has its seat at the G20, is more and more leveraging on the knowledge that is produced from our think tanks and our academia to be used by the knowledge users, which is our member states and our policymakers. So I want to use this opportunity to first of all thank a few institutions, area which is one of them. A thank you to Mr. Agbo and a team that has put this organization, this side event together, as well as Anna Celia from UFRJ and Luciana from EPEA. The topic that I was given is, I think, something that we need to not ignore, because urbanization is growing very rapidly. And this major trend is actually shaping how we live today, because we have to be very adaptive in how we make decisions. In specific, more people we know are moving to urban areas for various reasons, and the countries are experiencing this rapid economic transformation. While we generate a new set of challenges while we do that as well. In particular, Africa, because that's the context that I am speaking on today, this trend is becoming very pronounced, especially due to the rapidly growing youthful demographic population that we have in the continent, and about half of the world's population expected to live in urban areas by the mid-century. So we certainly need to rethink the sustainability on governance issues. And NEPAD, the African Union Development Agency, particularly works in the regional and the global context. And today I'll just touch slightly on some of the trends that we look at, the research, the cooperation, adaptive governance, and building this resilience. Regarding the trend, we understand that trends are shaping growth for urbanization, and therefore it is important to build this capacity and analyze these trends towards key support towards policy making, and how then they would address this. We heard earlier about lifestyle changes, and we heard how the decisions that are made on the ground from the top down must impact our citizens and our people. I think the global development agenda, Agenda 2063, as well as the continental one, which is Agenda 2063, is important to have this more people-centric approach. Regarding the research capabilities of institutions, we are finding that it's absolutely imperative, especially on topics such as urbanization, climate change, catastrophic and exponential risk. It's important. And the program, again, that I lead on has been instrumental in supporting our African member states and regional institutions to map out some of these trends and attend to these responses, especially through the futures approach. So the futures and foresight analysis and scenario building that I had a wonderful conversation with Katerina over lunch. It's wonderful to know that this innovative, and I would like to say innovative thinking because it's new and it hasn't been explored to its optimal, but we are making sure that our governments and policymakers get access to this information so that it can inform based from the past, which is an historical context, based on what we have in the present, as well as how it will shape our future. So it's very important on this long-term planning. And this is where these meetings have actually demonstrated how a conversation from a T20 agenda can move into a G20 process and bring the technical content closer to the policy workers. And that's what we have done. We have introduced the life economies through Gallery, and the Brazilian government has commissioned us now to do this study as a baseline study on life economies to probe this innovative economic models of well-being and looking at all the various economies, whether it's the blue economy, the green economy, the donut economy, etc. And that's what we are doing. In the institution, the way in which I do that is that we have erudite series where we bring in experts and we invite our think tanks, academia, and policy makers to engage in these platforms to learn and from this newly shared knowledge. Regarding cooperation, we have building connections in terms of synergies between the global south and the global north through trilateral corporations, through cooperation that includes both state and non-state actors, and to draw from the experiences and knowledge, and so that we can have expertise towards a more mutually beneficial way. And a good example is UK, Brazil, and Africa. We have a trilateral cooperation there on demographic dividends, where we are training our African member states to collect this data from the ground up and plug it into the ministers that actually use this information to shape their policies. Regarding the need for, I hear a lot about capacity building, but I think more importantly, we need to design institutional strengthening. I think it's important that we do this in order to respond to these changing trends that we have, as well as the challenges, in order to seize these opportunities of whether it's globalization, whether it's climate change, and key fundamental topics that our leaders are talking at global platforms. Again, I want to come back to the Agenda 2063, which is an African development framework. And this is an illustrative example of how African governments not only taking up long-term commitments, short-term commitments, but long-term commitments in terms of this is a 50-year plan for the continent. But how we have approached it is in an iterative approach, where we looking at it in 10-year implementation cycles. And this year, the African Union has just launched the second report, and we've come up with concrete moonshots to guide member states to align their national development plans with some of these moonshots in terms of having double-digit growth and, working with international corporations. And we are probing that this national development plans of our countries are aligned to this. And then coming back to the urban areas, which has become a core of human settlements and civilizations, it is necessary to build resilience, to withstand the challenges that we have been discussing in terms of climate change, of inequality, of sustainability, in order to develop innovative solutions posed by these challenges. I have often attended the Global Solutions Summit, and I've always said that it's not a solution summit because it's just to amplify all the challenges that we have. And that's why it is important that the coming together is really, really including our researchers and our scientists as well, that is available, so that we can ensure that the content is from a very informed. Often we have our scientists speaking a totally different language as to the policymakers. So I think that We need to access that information, but it needs to be packaged and digested in a way that is almost consumable. And it is important to also understand that the risks that we have is there to, should better design more resilient institutions that is capable of withstanding and adapting to these future challenges that we have. And this knowledge, I call this a knowledge platform because we are sharing and we're learning from each other, is essential to strengthen our policies. And not only to address our immediate development goals, but to safeguard this long-term sustainability in terms of climate and risk security that we have. So with this, I just want to say that it is very important that we create this sustainability and resilient future platforms to ensure that, especially in the African context, we can share our perspectives and priorities so that we integrate it into these global decision-making processes and we can leverage for the global support. So I thank you.
Muito obrigada, professora Pão. Agora teremos o colega Rafael Pereira, do IPEA.
Good afternoon, everyone. My slides are in English, but I'll stick my presentation to Portuguese just to follow the chair of the session. Então, boa tarde a todos. Obrigado mais uma vez pela oportunidade de estar presente no evento com vocês. Me apresentando pela bio que me passaram, meu nome é Rafael Pereira, eu sou pesquisador do IPEA, o Instituto de Pesquisa Econômica Aplicada do Governo Federal. E eu estou atualmente como coordenador de ciência de dados do IPEA e eu sou professor visitante no Departamento de Geography and Planning da Universidade de Toronto, no Canadá. A minha formação de pesquisador ela é fundamentalmente focada em questões urbanas e de mobilidade urbana. Então, a minha linha de pesquisa investiga o papel das políticas urbanas e de transporte na organização espacial das cidades e as implicações disso para questões de desigualdades sociais e de saúde. A minha formação é de sociologia, demografia, mas eu acabei fazendo um doutorado em geografia na Universidade de Oxford, no Reino Unido. Então, no IPEA eu tenho dois chapéus. Um chapéu é o Rafael pesquisador de mobilidade urbana, transporte, e um é o chapéu coordenador de ciência de dados. No chapéu de coordenador de ciência de dados, a gente tem várias tarefas para atender demandas do governo federal, inclusive da Casa Civil, e eu vou falar rapidamente um pouquinho sobre um projeto específico que a gente teve que se envolver, lidando com a questão da emergência climática, das enchentes que ocorreram no Rio Grande do Sul, no estado do Rio Grande do Sul, na região sul do país. Estava funcionando até agora há pouco, eu prometo. Pronto. Bom, se vocês estão todos aqui, eu acho que eu não preciso gastar muito tempo para explicar por que as mudanças climáticas são presentes, elas são extremamente importantes. O gráfico do Warming Colors, do Ed Hawkins, fez um incrível trabalho de popularizar a preocupação com as questões das mudanças climáticas e o aquecimento global. A questão é por que a gente deveria focar nas cidades, quando a gente fala em emergência climática. Hoje, as cidades são o local de maior concentração de infraestrutura, atividades econômicas e serviços públicos. Praticamente todos os países do mundo hoje ou são altamente urbanizados ou eles estão atingindo rápido e acelerado processo de urbanização. O que significa que eventos drásticos, eventos extremos de mudanças climáticas que afetam as cidades têm um altíssimo impacto, um altíssimo potencial de impacto para atingir muitas vidas e o desenvolvimento econômico do planeta. Dentro desse tema, a gente acabou enfrentando recentemente no Brasil um caso dramático das maiores enchentes vivenciadas no estado do Rio Grande do Sul nos últimos anos. Dentro desse contexto, a Casa Civil do Governo Federal criou grupos de emergência para lidar com a situação e nós do IPEA, assim como outros órgãos do Governo Federal, foram chamados para a ação. Eu tinha um outro projeto para falar rapidamente ao final, mas eu acho que não vai dar tempo. Se der tempo, eu falo um pouquinho dele. Mas em termos bem rápidos, o que a Casa Civil do Governo Federal criou foram dois grupos. O primeiro grupo foi coordenado pela Agência Nacional de Águas e pelo o INPE, o Instituto Nacional de Pesquisas Espaciais, junto com o CEMADEM, que é o Centro de Monitoramento de Desastres Naturais do Brasil. E a grande missão desse grupo, que incluía, inclusive, o Exército Brasileiro, o Estado do Rio Grande do Sul, era criar a mancha oficial de impacto. Qual é a área afetada? Então, eles usaram diversas metodologias com imagens de satélite, modelos hidrológicos, modelos dinâmicos de elevação do solo, e eles chegaram, depois de várias iterações, à mancha oficial. Essa é a área que foi impactada por enchentes, deslizamentos de água, deslizamentos de terra e deslizamentos de lama. O segundo grupo partiu do output do primeiro grupo, que era a mancha, para a gente tentar entender, ok, se essa é a mancha impactada, quem foi impactado? Qual é o tamanho do estrago dessas enchentes? Nesse segundo grupo, então, a gente, uma série de trabalhos tentando identificar qual foi a população afetada, as empresas afetadas e os serviços públicos afetados. No caso, a gente teve uma participação bem envolvida, bem coordenada do Instituto de Pesquisa Econômica Aplicada, o Instituto Brasileiro de Geografia e Estatística e, naturalmente, de órgãos do governo federal, como o Ministério do Desenvolvimento Social, Ministério da Saúde, Educação e Trabalho. A nossa relação do IPEA dentro desse projeto foi muito vinculada à parceria com o IBGE e, principalmente, com o Ministério do Desenvolvimento Social e com o Ministério do Trabalho. E eu quero destacar o Ministério do Trabalho por uma razão. O Ministério do Trabalho, assim que começam as primeiras semanas de drásticas enchentes do Rio Grande do Sul, o Ministério do Trabalho criou um programa emergencial de transferência de renda para trabalhadores que foram atingidos. O Ministério publica uma portaria definindo uma política. Todo trabalhador cujo local de trabalho foi afetado está elegível a receber 2 meses de um salário mínimo. Quem definiu se o trabalhador era elegível ou não foi esse nosso grupo de trabalho que a gente coordenou pelo IPEA. Como a gente fez isso? E aí tem uma das questões de governance e building capability in the government, que é extremamente importante. Dentro do governo federal, nós temos uma série de bases de dados ou registros administrativos que nos indicam qual é o local de residência das pessoas. Base de CPF da Receita Federal, a base de cadastro único do Ministério do Desenvolvimento Social ou do Bolsa Família. E onde estão as empresas com a base da RAIS ou com o E-Social. Graças a essas bases, a gente fez de maneira muito rápida a geolocalização de onde estão as pessoas, onde estão as empresas, as firmas e os empregos. Então, sem entrar muito em detalhes, a gente só conseguiu fazer isso num tempo tão rápido, porque dentro do IPEA a gente já tem um projeto de médio e longo prazo, que é a BMAP, que é a construção de uma base multidimensional para monitoramento e avaliação de políticas públicas, onde a gente tenta fazer o linkage da base de pessoas com a base de educação, com a base de saúde, com a base de previdência e assim por diante. Então a gente tem vários registros administrativos, onde a gente tenta acompanhar cada cidadão e os seus membros familiares ao longo do tempo. Suas condições de renda, de saúde, de educação, aonde essa pessoa mora, quais serviços públicos essa pessoa tem acesso e quais ela não tem acesso. E com isso a gente consegue criar um sistema mais inteligente de monitoramento e avaliação de impacto de como as políticas estão chegando nas pessoas. A parte que me cabe nesse projeto, uma delas é geolocalizar essas pessoas. Então a gente tem um esforço dentro do IPEA de fazer a geolocalização de todos os registros administrativos do governo federal para todos os anos. Isso significa que todas essas bases em azul já foram geolocalizadas. Isso significa que a gente já geolocalizou aproximadamente 1 bilhão de endereços. Tem uma série de questões técnicas sobre como a gente faz isso do ponto de vista de ciência de dados de uma maneira eficiente, e é um custo muito, muito baixo. Mas não cabe vir ao caso. Rapidamente, quais são os principais resultados? A área afetada do Rio Grande do Sul foi em todo o estado, essa mancha em vermelho no mapa, e ela equivale a cerca de 16 mil quilômetros quadrados. Na unidade de medida oficial do Brasil, são aproximadamente 2 milhões de campos de futebol. Isso significa que de todos os 497 municípios do estado, praticamente 84% foram decretados em estado de emergência ou estado de calamidade. Quando a gente olha para a população afetada, a gente encontra que aproximadamente 9% de todas as pessoas tiveram seu local de residência diretamente atingido pela água ou pela lama e pelos deslizamentos. Quando a gente olha para a população vulnerável que está registrada no cadastro único, isso chega a quase 10%, e isso é a média do estado. Mas como vocês podem ver, a área de impacto ela é muito concentrada em algumas regiões. Quando a gente olha para os municípios mais afetados, essa taxa de impacto chega a 70% ou 60% da população. É como se mais da metade da população desses municípios tivessem sido imediatamente afetadas ou atingidas pelas enchentes. Em termos de empregos e postos de trabalho, o estado do Rio Grande do Sul tinha aproximadamente 2,4 milhões de postos de empregos formais, aproximadamente 243 mil firmas, e cerca de 14% de todos esses postos de trabalho foram diretamente atingidos. Em algumas cidades isso chegou a 80%. Mesmo na cidade de Porto Alegre, que é a maior cidade da região sul do Brasil, isso chegou a praticamente 30%. Então a gente está falando de uma ordem de magnitude de impacto extremamente severo. Quais são alguns pontos rápidos de aprendizado que eu acho que são importantes para colegas de outros países e outros contextos? Lidar com eventos extremos, lidar com eventos extremamente dinâmicos. É um moving target que a gente tem que acompanhar. As pessoas mudam de lugar, os eventos climáticos eles acontecem a cada dia em lugares diferentes, e você fazer o monitoramento disso em tempo real para uma política de assessoramento à população é extremamente difícil. Numa situação como essa, é extremamente necessário você ter uma resposta ágil e rápida. No entanto, a gente precisa lidar com grandes bases de dados da ordem de bilhões de informações, em alguns casos, de uma maneira muito rápida, o que tem um custo computacional e de tempo de processamento muito alto. Por isso é importante ter soluções de ciência de dados relativamente eficientes. Fazer a geolocalização desses endereços sempre tem uma série de desafios e problemas. É muito difícil a gente encontrar o endereço das pessoas que moram em zonas rurais, especialmente em áreas urbanas informais e favelas, onde o cadastro de endereços, como nesses contextos, não é tão formalizado e tão bem definido. E por fim, penúltimo ponto, como que você estima e como você comunica a incerteza. Quando a gente geolocaliza o endereço, você não sabe exatamente o ponto exato onde a pessoa está. Quando você gera uma imagem de satélite e você identifica aquela mancha, o método que você utiliza tem margem de erro. Agora, como que você comunica essa margem de erro para definir para um cidadão se você está mais ou menos elegível a receber uma política pública? E, por fim, é extremamente importante a gente pensar em questões de coordenação institucional e governança. Numa situação de emergência, onde todas as decisões precisam ser tomadas da maneira mais rápida possível e coordenando diversos órgãos de diferentes níveis de governo, a governança se torna talvez o elemento mais essencial para conseguir a gente dar aquela resposta rápida e ágil. A gente ainda tem bastante avanço para fazer. Eu acho que essa foi uma experiência muito interessante, a gente avançou bastante, mas eu imagino que isso todos esses problemas sejam problemas compartilhados não só no Brasil, mas estados brasileiros, mas em outros países também. Eu acho que eu já extrapolei meu tempo. Eu falei tão rápido que eu ainda tenho 2 minutos. Então, eu queria aproveitar os 2 minutos para agradecer à equipe. A gente teve um projeto, foi uma parceria incrível com os colegas do Departamento de Geociências do IBGE, com os colegas do CEMADEM, da ANA, da Casa Civil. E, enfim, no final das contas, eu adoraria falar sobre o outro projeto, que é sobre o projeto Acesso a Oportunidades, que é um projeto onde a gente estima o acesso da população a oportunidades de emprego, saúde, educação, serviços públicos e proteção social para cada quarteirão de todas as grandes cidades do Brasil. E esse é um projeto que, no fundo, ele tem um casamento muito direto com questões de mudanças climáticas, porque os grandes bancos de fomento internacional hoje em dia, quando financiam grandes obras de infraestrutura e transporte, eles querem entender qual que é o grau de resiliência do seu sistema de transporte. Quando você constrói uma linha de metrô ou um BRT, qual que é a resiliência daquele sistema caso ele seja afetado por um evento extremo de mudança climática. E mais do que você entender que uma determinada linha de metrô parou de funcionar por causa das enchentes, você precisa entender quais serviços públicos as pessoas ficaram cortadas daquele serviço público porque a linha de metrô parou de funcionar. Ou porque o sistema de ônibus não funciona mais. De quais oportunidades de serviços públicos as pessoas passam a ficar excluídas como consequência desses eventos extremos. E num contexto de mudanças climáticas, nós teremos cada vez mais eventos extremos e os eventos extremos ficarão cada vez mais extremos. Então, essa agenda de pesquisa sobre ter uma infraestrutura de ciência de dados e registros nacionais, registros administrativos centralizados, que é um desafio muito grande para colegas da Índia e outros países da África subsaariana e do Sudeste Asiático, como a gente precisa de ter essa infraestrutura e capacidade de Estado de ciência de dados para pensar respostas ágeis, para lidar com esses sistemas, com esses eventos, mas também para planejar sistemas de transporte que sejam resilientes também. Agora eu falei 12 minutos. Obrigado.
Muito obrigado, Rafael. Então, mais uma brilhante fala aqui, né? E agora vamos passar para o professor Guilherme Plonsky, da USP, no Instituto de Economia. Professor, também peço que faça uma breve apresentação do seu currículo, da sua bio.
Obrigado. Hi, good afternoon. Let me just see if I'm in the right, no, you have to put my presentation. Not counting the time, huh? Yeah. Hi, good afternoon again. I begin by thanking the indefatigable Professor Ana Celia Castro for her very kind invitation. The main question in the program that you received is how can data, information, and technological advancements, such as AI and IoT, be leveraged to enhance urban resilience? We heard a very interesting presentation by Rafael, and to make it go further, the short answer to the question is in many ways. We heard from Rafael, and here you have, oops, how does this go here in front? Oops, now, yes. The short answer is in many ways. You have here a list of possibilities integrating data systems and monitoring. Digital twins can stimulate urban scenarios and test resilience strategies and so on and so forth. We need to have attention to challenges in system integration across different platforms and agencies, and obviously the digital divide and accessibility issues. For some Freudian reason, this alert appeared twice. I would like to move in a slightly complementary way and look to what the question to us was posed from the Brazilian perspective, if I can say so. Let's begin by looking to the definition of urban resilience. The UN Habitat Urban Resilience Hub defines it very broadly as a measurable ability of any urban system with its inhabitants to maintain continuity through all shocks and stresses while positively adapting and transforming toward sustainability. Now, this is a question, this is a definition that I would like to put in the context of the elections that we had last month in Brazil, where around 5,700 new mayors were elected. In the state of São Paulo, where I come from, 645, a bit more than half of them are mayors for the first time. So an association established a kind of a seminar for new mayors in order for them to understand what their challenges are, what the threats are, etc., etc. And I wonder if that definition would be read the way it is presented. I bet that for at least 80% of the people present, this would come to their mind. What's that? So we would knock out probably 80% at least of the mayors with this very sophisticated and very correct definition. So I think one issue is how to communicate what resilience is. And a way of doing it is translating it into Brazilian Urbanish and using something which was written by a brilliant zoologist, Professor Paulo Vanzolini, that was born exactly 100 years ago. He was a director of the Museum of Zoology at our university, but he also liked very much the night. And he composed several samba songs. And one of the most famous that I believe here everybody could think with me, but let's not do it. Reconhece a queda e não desanima, levanta, sacode a poeira e dá volta por cima. Okay, what does it mean in English? Yeah, dar a volta por cima enters the Brazilian dictionary. A kind of a translation, it recognizes a fall if some problem happens. Recognize the fall, don't be discouraged, get up, shake off the dust and bounce back or turn around. It's kind of not ideal, but kind of a translation of this part. I think this the mayors would understand. And this is probably really, resilience in Brazilian Urbanish. Now, Brazilian is well known for creativity. But the crux for resilience is life cycle management. We have in Brazil, I think, we are competent in diagnosing our problems, in establishing good plans, but we are less good in implementing and in maintaining. So if we go to what the UNDP suggests as the characteristics of resilient cities, they have to be reflective, resourceful, inclusive, integrated, robust, flexible, and redundancy, Superman or superperson cities. I would say that the situation in Brazil is kind of, as you can see, we have good examples, but we have also some problems. Let me, with regard to the issue of the life cycle management, make two very brief examples. One, 1977, long time ago, the overtopping of two dams in the Pardo River in the state of São Paulo. They belong to the electric power utility company, a very large company, very well known company. So the question is, why did the disaster happen? Well, obviously, a lot of concentrated rain. But first, obviously, everybody proposes some reasons that suggest malversation. Oh, the designer was a friend of the whoever, or the constructor, the builder, used second-hand materials. Anyhow, but after a multidisciplinary engineering consulting company was commissioned, what was found out is the main failures were non-structural, were in terms of documentation, of awareness, and of authority level. In terms of documentation, the plans that were there, the documents were from the original design of the dam, but not the as-built and all changes that have been made later. So obviously, this had to be corrected. Second, in terms of awareness, people were not always had very clear idea about basic things. For instance, if you have a river, the river is not like this on the side, it's like this. So if you have 1 meter of water coming, you have the measure of the level of the river. 1 meter going up is different if the river is low or if the river is high. And, you know, basic facts. So you had to retrain the staff. And finally, the most critical is authority level. A year before the tragedy that happened, some more water came, and the person who was in charge opened the gates to let some of the pressure down, and he was dismissed for the company. Why? Because he did it without asking for permission from the headquarters. So the next year, when this came, what happened was another operator was there. The chief of the dam, he went to the city, but there was no communication because the weather was terrible, so it was impossible to communicate. He was there. He knew what happened to the person before him. He said, I won't open this dam if I don't have a specific, strict order. So he didn't receive the order, and what you saw is what happened. Everything went down. The second case is Porto Alegre, underwater, that have been presented here much, but I would like just to cite a statement by the mayor of the city about the system to control the dams. What he basically says is, as you can probably not read, but what he basically says that all the system didn't work the way it should have worked because it was not maintained. So I think these are examples. I'm not talking about the most famous case now, Mariana, which is still under jurisdiction, so I won't make any comment, but it's hundreds of billions of reais are involved. It's a damage, besides the human damage, obviously, and then damage to nature. But I would say that we have to understand why mayors or why cities don't invest in important things like maintenance, etc. There might be cultural reasons, obviously, because you don't get a picture in the newspaper. But another dimension of resilience, when we talk about urban resilience, that we usually don't talk about, is financial resilience in contemporary cities. We had in our Institute for Advanced Studies, which is a brother of the institute here of the Colégio Brasileiro de Altos Estudos, we had during 5 years a group exactly dealing with financial resilience in contemporary city, comparing first São Paulo, Belém, Manaus, Goiânia, and then concentrating on the community level, the slums or favelas in São Paulo and Belém. By the way, Belém is the headquarters of the next COP. It is a city where 58% of the population lives in slums. And if we are looking at the Amazon, we have to look for the Amazon from the perspective of what helps the earth and the whole population to have air, fresh air, and breathe. But if we want to see the people as a center in the Amazon, we have to understand that almost 70% of the population of Amazons lives in city. And like in Belém, 58, in Manaus, 57% of the population lives in slums. So we have to see also this aspect. Here, for the sake of time, I won't get into details, some specifics from the research that was done on the subject. Here we have a map of, in Brazil recently, we have the information that there are 12,000 and so slums or other names. 16.4 million people live in such situation. And as was mentioned before, 18% of the slum area in Brazil are in regions that can be considered under risk. But I would just like to add that you have risk in this for this population, which has nothing to do with geological condition. For instance, we have issues of fire in slums, and a fire in a slum is terrible for different reasons. First, because it's the whole utilities are substandard. Second, because for social reasons, there is a higher risk of having a fire. And third, because if you call the fire people, you don't have an address. The fire truck cannot go through those places. So if we want really to talk about urban resilience and to talk about these communities, we have to look beyond, not only, but beyond the geological aspects. I won't take the time, but during the tenure at IPT, we did a project that got a prize of developing a fire safety program in precarious urban settlements with a lot of organizations. But in a nutshell, the idea is to have, in Brazil, you don't have what you have in the US, other countries, the voluntary fire people that are not professionals, but they help the community. So to develop this system in these communities and was very successful. Now, if I'm going to the end, if we want to have from, let's say, from our possible brains some fruits, giving an example, we have in our institute there a program called Urban Resilience in Action, protecting our cities from extreme climate events. And this is being done. This is being done in 6 seminars. 2 already happened, and the transparencies will stay with you. You can see that a lot of people different from the communities. And here you have at the end a link if you want to connect to these people. And the idea is exactly for the university to leave the discussion room and go to work with the community to co-develop solutions for the increase of urban resilience. Thank you so much. Oh, finally, forgot. You know this guy. Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum to place it on, and I will move the world. So I believe that the university can be a fulcrum.
Obrigado, professor Guilherme. Muito interessante os pontos que você trouxe. Agora eu vou passar aqui para o professor Ambu, do ERIA.
And thank you and good evening. My name is Anbu Moli from Iria and Jakarta. I'm based in Jakarta. I'm the last in the panel and everything has been said and I don't know what to say. And but I wanted to re-emphasize and the points that has been said. And one thing is coming to the disasters and the climate change, the most impacted people and the most impacted countries are in the global south. Why they are impacted and their capacity and capability is very much limited. And it is continuing. My second point here is the battle for the disaster resilience or the climate change will be won or will be lost in urban centers, because most of the growth is happening there and most of the populations are living there. To address that, Asia is doing several experimentations and there are some lessons to be learned. These lessons also provide us opportunities for collaboration and within the global south. That is my point, and to support these 3 points, I will run through some of the facts that is happening. And this one. Okay. Yeah. So this one is the point that is I would like to emphasize is the disaster. When you look into the disasters, and this is the kind of an estimated billions and the proportion of the damage that has been caused. If you look, most of this damage is caused in Americas, including the Brazil, and then the developing Asian countries. If you zoom in and Asia, and if you look into the disaster that is happening, and in the last 10 years, if you calculate the GDP, it is almost 22% of the GDP is lost. And what is the difference between the advanced economies like Japan and emerging economies like Indonesia is one thing is the economic damages are limited, and it is same for both the countries, but the human losses are more in the developing countries. That is what the statistic says. Then comes this climate crisis. We need to distinguish between the natural disasters and the climate-induced disasters. The climate-induced disaster, if you look in this map, and Asia is the most populous region, most populous continent, and most of the poor people also living there. So this climate-induced disasters has an impact on the food security, water security, and the energy security. And we estimated about 6 to 7% of the global GDP, and the regional GDP could be lost by 2050. So if we combine together the disasters and the climate, we have all the narratives to tell. I think morning Lavanya mentioned about it, and the macroeconomics. So whatever that is we achieved in the past, the economic growth may be derailing. It may be putting more people under the poverty and the inequality. That's where there is actions are needed, and these actions need to be focused, and where you can start. That is where there is the narrative of urban centers comes. So this is shows there is the how much of the population that is living. You can see there is most of the populations are living in the coastal areas, in the urban centers. And these urban centers, and this is the case in Southeast Asia, and you can see that is the urban share of the country population. Now more than 70 or 80% of the population is living in the urban areas. And it has been increasing, and nearly if you put these 10 small and medium-sized economies in the ASEAN, I think nearly 70% of the populations will be living in the urban centers. So from the planning perspective, from the economic perspective, from the social development perspective, these urban centers are important to climate change adaptation or resilience. This shows that is where the annual growth is happening in Asia. I think, and here in Asia you can differentiate. There are 3 tiers of the cities and the urban centers. The mega cities, there is already locked in this infrastructure. Second thing is the second tier cities. They are fast becoming the mega cities. They need that infrastructure needs, and that demands for the transport is increasing faster than the economic growth. Then we do have the third tier cities. But most of this economic growth and the infrastructure will be happening in these cities. And if you build a infrastructure that is susceptible to this climate change, the disasters, then you are locking in. This is kind of vicious circle that is we are building. So this is a case that is in Vietnam, and where Vietnam is witnessing increasing frequency of the typhoons, floods. But again, if you look into that is the FDI, the investment, they are going into the coastal cities that attract more investment, knowing that the risk that is private investments and the infrastructure are built along the coastal cities. It is a kind of we see a circle of both the public and the private investment that's happening that become a kind of a standard assets very soon. Another aspect of the cities, particularly in Asia, I think we just now Professor mentioned about the Brazil, and if you look into these cities in Asia, and they grow fast, they also help poverty elevation, but at the same time, so if you look into it, this city is also becoming gravity center for the inequality, where the ultra rich and the poor people live together. So when the disaster occurs, when the climate change vulnerability is happening, and the most affected people are in the lowest bottom, they become much more susceptible, and their life become a kind of risky. Most of the families, the low income families, face an existential threat. So that is where Asia is looking for a smart cities, or the kind of application of the ICT technologies for improving the resilience. So here this is Asia. If you look into it, and the speed at which it is growing, it's all this growth is happening in the last 30 years. For Europe, it took nearly 200 years. So they slowly learned, and they could able to build the resilient city, but it is not complete. But the thing is, in Asia, most of this happening, the growth is happening in 30-year period. The speed at which it is happening is not sustainable. So that caused many problems, including this climate risk, and also inequality and the security. So what could be the option? It has been trying, it has been experimenting the green cities, the resilient cities. Now we moved into a kind of a paradigm of smart cities, where we are introducing this application of this ICT technologies and the artificial intelligence to make the cities much more intelligent. So there are 26 cities in the Southeast Asia. They formed the alliance of the smart cities. They have a common vision, but the different operational parameters in the application of these ICT technologies. So the basics of this smart cities is 3 I's. One is the instrumentation. You're putting the more instruments, you collect the more data, and then integrate the data, and this integrated data is used for the intelligent decision making. So this approach brings efficiency and also bring innovation, where there is a public and private partnership happens, and more inclusion, and it is happening, but at a slow speed, but a varying speed. So this is an example, and these 10 cities in the Southeast Asia, how they built a partnership with the big IT companies. Basically, they come in and they help it to improve the infrastructure. This infrastructure is built based on providing the better transport, providing the better energy, providing the better water, and the better waste management system. And this is one of the examples in Japan, how that instrumentation, this is Takamatsu, this is a coastal city, which is more susceptible to the disasters, typhoons. And here they built a system where the kind of a dashboard approach, where the instrumentations are built, and they developed an early warning system. And this early warning system is people-centric, where that people can contribute and they can also benefit from it. So this has been developed, this IoT platform was used for the disaster management, and also for the development of this resilient tourism stages, and also bringing a kind of a platform where the public, private sector, and the government can come together, make intelligent decisions for the future and climate risk-ready cities. And that example that exists in Japan, Japan is one of the most vulnerable countries to these disasters. They have frequent earthquakes, and then typhoons, and also the drought exists. So how Japan held it, and they mobilized, they have the technology, but the technology needs finance. So this finance comes in domestic resource mobilization, basically from reforming the tax structure. And you can see that is how from the 1946 to 2000, how their budget outlay has been increased building the resilient infrastructure. Then it could be able to see there is the kind of a human losses, and it completely reduced. It is now almost nil. But Japan made that investment, and they developed a public and private financial instruments to support this resilience. But if you come into the Japan, not all the countries are risk ready. And if you come into this emerging economies in Asia, the type of risk that is, as a morning, I think first panel, we talked about this ex post and ex ante. If the disaster occurs, where the communities go for the finance, and it is first priority is the kinship arrangement. They first go to the family and their relatives. Then only they go for that. Second is the when it happens, and they go for the kind of a mutual agreement. That is where that local government, the immediate help is coming from the local government. First is your family. Second is the local government. Third only, that is the kind of a national government where the budget items are here. So here we find there is a kind of a 3 layers of this finance that is helping. That's risk avoidance. One is that is the non-market, where that is coming from the kind of a social capital that is built upon the binding relationship among the stakeholders and the communities. And the second is intertemporal. Basically, they use their savings, and the local government and this kinship and the government and is using, that is the government. Some governments, particularly the Singapore and Malaysia and the Indonesia, they are coming together to develop a catastrophic bond market that has been used to finance this ex-ante measures. And market-based transfer, it is not yet common, and knowing that is most of the population, nearly 80% of the populations are disaster prone, but only 70% of them are insured. So that is where the most of the governmental efforts are looking into it. So currently these 10 countries are coming together to develop a common pool of resources, where the public resources and the private resources and the community funds are pooled together and develop a kind of risk fund, and that could be subscribed by the countries and the communities and the companies. So if you look into this urban resilience and what could be the building blocks based on this lessons that is learned from the Asian cities, I think there are 3 pathways. One is that is the policy domain, where we need much more regulations, how to control your investments and the infrastructures. And second thing is developing the guidelines for the smart cities. That is that smart city network helps it. And third one is how you are providing the incentives for the companies and the communities. And the second area is the investment, and then this is one area that is much more experimentation and innovation is needed, and that include the structuring and the restructuring of the current subsidies and the incentives. And third most important thing is the capacity development, and here almost all the cities are in the same board. They are much more disaster prone and then climate risk, but here learning from the cities is much more needed, and sometimes this framework doesn't help us. And for example, in the case of disaster, it happened in Jakarta, Indonesia, and that the nearby city Bandung was hit by the typhoon. But neighboring city and Jakarta could not help. They have the resources, but they cannot transfer the fund to the neighboring city. Then it becomes, they need to convene the municipal assembly, then municipal assembly need to attest the process, then only the transfer happens. So here we need to see that is the regulatory framework, existing framework that need to be looked in to make it more cities are becoming disaster responsive. So this is my last slide, and it could be a kind of a suggestions where the G20 could work on it. And when we are building the disaster risk mechanisms or the climate resilience, and there are 3 things are needed. One is the information. That is, we need to have an correct and accurate data, and that has been emphasized in the previous presentations. So this information and the data and the early warning system is needed. There is the first one, and that could happen under the government to government relationship and the government to government level. Developing that information, the database, and sharing it will be helping. And the second thing is finance. I think it has been emphasized in the last 2 panels. And here insurance industry and the bond market could help. I think here it is completely in the private domain, and what type of partnership and business to business partnership need to evolve. So that is, it is mutually supportive. And third one is there is a role for the communities, particularly the entrepreneurship and the social entrepreneurship. That is where there is a people-to-people partnership is needed. And Brazil is in the midst of this global south, and Indonesia did work on it, and then India has also built upon it, particularly the second pillar. And the third pillar is with the Brazil. And if you work on it and if you develop a framework, it will be a kind of a souvenir for South Africa to take it lead. Thank you very much.
Foi incrível aqui todas as apresentações, né? Como que a gente está aí num processo de construção, de como que os países vão avançar para a construção dessas cidades resilientes, né? O Brasil também está trabalhando nessa agenda. Agora, em 2024, o presidente Lula, em setembro, fez um despacho presidencial, né, Rafael. A gente está trabalhando aí no fortalecimento da reestruturação do Sistema Nacional de Proteção e Defesa Civil, e a gente vê que não é só o Brasil, né, que está pensando sobre isso. Eu vou abrir aqui para as perguntas. Temos aqui um primeiro. Tem a professora lá atrás. Quem que está com... Por favor, nome e instituição e a pergunta.
Tapiano Canuto, here, Policy Center for the New South, Brookings and George Washington University. Thank you very much for all for our presentations were really extremely useful and quite interesting. Just two comments, in fact, one question. On the catastrophe bonds, at my times at the World Bank, we supported the issuance of a catastrophe bonds by the Caribbean islands. The project was broader than that. The idea was to propel this initiative among small states for obvious reasons, given the difficulties of scale of small economies to face. So the way forward was by exactly issuing catastrophe bonds. That was not without resistance, because the countries individually, some of them, hesitated in using their lending space, their capacity, by, let's say, make insurance against hypothetical events. So we had a resistance from the side of the clientele, but they exist. Unrelated to Rafael, 10 years ago, IPEA produced a report, at the time led by Sérgio Margulis and Nathalie Untestel. And that report on climate events had in one of its appendix a simulation where let's say, the black hole case was exactly what happened this year in the Rio Grande do Sul. Exactly. With a combination of some events, rain events, that thing would happen, and it did happen. Nonetheless, the recommendations from the report, including making larger, doing whatever it was necessary to cope with the issue, were downplayed, including some state authority even said that, well, they heard, but they hesitated to spend scarce budget resource for something the likelihood of which was low. But then 10 years later, it happened. And it was so disastrous because the recommendations that were there, contained in the appendix, were downplayed. So its issue is a similar thing, an underestimation of the pain if you don't spend regularly in what it takes in order to prevent against dramatic events. Because with all these events, okay, here, the likelihood is not high, so why will I spend my regular budget to something? My question is, do we have reasonably a map of similar events such as those in other parts of the country? To some extent, it's possible to imagine different combinations of those kinds of disasters and so at least to do some preparatory adaptation when necessary. The lessons to be learned from the disaster of this year in Rio Grande do Sul should lay deep in terms of ramping up our efforts to map out the possible tragic events. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you. Boa tarde, meu nome é Anete Cavalcante e eu serei breve, tá? Eu tenho uma inquietação, tá? E tenho uma preocupação também, tá? Inquietação e preocupação. A inquietação é esses desastres climáticos, independente do clima, de todo o aquecimento global, isso também não pode ser provocado por tecnologia ou a nuclear ou a IA, porque não tem muito tempo, uns 2 ou 3 meses talvez, não sei, eu sou muito ruim de datas, o Kim Jong-un falou que se o Ocidente ficasse incomodando muito, que ele mandaria por míssil, por mar, para atingir o Ocidente. Aí não estou falando dele, estou falando de uma forma geral que todos os grandes países têm tecnologia, alta tecnologia nesse aspecto, tá? Essa é a inquietação, tá? Lógico, somado com todos os outros fatores. E a outra, as grandes cidades, elas estão muito entupidas de pessoas, porque a população mundial aumentou, e se não seria viável, eu sei que isso demandaria uma série de outras questões de direcionar para cidades menores, de espalhar um pouco, a nível global mesmo, né? Porque isso está acontecendo em vários lugares. Agora mesmo aconteceu na Espanha, né? Então, essas duas questões que realmente vêm me incomodando, eu venho observando. Agora, eu não tenho conhecimento profundo para dizer se realmente isso pode acontecer, mas eu estou realmente bastante preocupada. A partir do desabafo dele, não só ele, outros países podem fazer a mesma coisa, como se fosse uma guerra subentendida, assim, sabe? Sei lá, eu tenho essa preocupação bastante, tá bom? Professora, aqui na frente, é a professora Tereza. Professora Tereza? Não? Então, eu vou passar aqui a palavra para o professor Ambu e para a professora Anla sobre a questão da pergunta do professor Otaviano Canuto.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. And catastrophic bond and the resistance, and that is also there. And I think this talk has been happening in 10 years, but they're slowly moving in progressively. And the first, it basically started with the bilateral, and Singapore and Malaysia, and then now Indonesia comes. It is how that is moving progressively. But it has a two lens. One is when we are thinking about the catastrophic bond, and the disaster and the climate change is a risk, and this some of the risk could be reduced, and some risk could be transferred, and some will remain as a residual, and the residual part we cannot change, that will remain there. And so this catastrophic bond comes where there is a risk transfer can take place, and there is the currently from the financing perspective, and so far this risk is financial risks are taken up by the public sector, and one way to transfer the risk to the private sector is this a catastrophic bond. That is how we see. And the second thing is also when coming to the resources, and particularly it is in the Asia, and government doesn't have much fiscal space, but the private sector has the plenty of resources, and this is not happening coming to this disaster risk or the climate change adaptation. They wanted to make money, and so how to bring them, and this is one way of building a kind of a partnership. And on the budget and the national, this is a common story. It happened, and in the Asia, and ESCAP did an analysis and how much budget has been allocated and for the disaster, and there are budget outlays, and when the disaster occurs, there is a non-budget outlay. There is a kind of a developmental aid has been diverted to this disaster risk management and the recovery, and that is what happening. It is calculated to be around 12% in some countries like Laos and Myanmar, and this is a huge for them. But you know, that is the hard reality is, as a humankind, and we have a short memory, so the disaster occurs, and then people immediately respond to it, and the government respond, and after 2 or 3 months, again, we are coming back to the same status, and we forget that this kind of business as usual. And that is where the much more information and the much more innovations need to be happen, and unfortunately, it is happening at the slow speed. That is what we can see, and I acknowledge, and this is also some kind of one thing is in India. I don't know about the Brazil, and there the countries and the governments are working in silos, and the disaster management lies with the Ministry of Interior or Ministry of Home Affairs, and then the climate risk management is taken up by the environmental ministries, and then finance ministry is overseeing it, so this is a kind of status quo. Some countries, for example, Philippines, and established a disaster management authority that has been directly reporting the president. So that helps when the disaster occurs, and then it has been accounted how much there is the budget outlays are for, and some kind of an institutional framework it need to be there, and that structuring and the reform is needed to build the resilient society, and also how we can utilize this available budget and the resources more efficiently and effectively, and in this regard, and I also would like to emphasize that could be a kind of an example for Latin America also. ASEAN has developed a AMDER, that is the agreement on the disaster risk management. And for example, if the disaster occurs, and if it was declared as a national calamity, and then this national borders disappear temporarily. So for example, on the relief systems, and then information could be landed. For example, Indonesia can send their immediate aid to the Malaysia, and they don't need to wait for the permission to grant it. And that kind of agreement works, and it is one of the golden agreement. It has been activated only 3 times. And so when the disaster occurs, the national borders disappears temporarily. And then and it helped the people, particularly during that golden hour of the recovery, and it helped them to give that is a aid, that is the first golden aid that happened in the first 72 hours. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Professor.
Título de catástrofes, a pergunta do professor Otaviano. Oh, sorry.
It's okay. Professor, can you please ask your question again?
Professor Otaviano, quer fazer a pergunta novamente?
About African countries, I think you said? Uh-huh.
Okay.
I guess one of the points you raised has been raised also by another question in the previous section before lunch. And the colleague at the back of the room, she was saying, it's quite ironic, but also catastrophic that governments, they have to face fiscal crises at the moment. They have fiscal constraints now. So they prefer not to spend money on adaptation and just leave it when the shit happens, and then they try to mitigate the environmental effects of a disaster that happened. And I guess that speaks a lot to the problems of what you're saying. The second point you raised about whether Brazil has other studies about areas that could be potentially affected by future disasters. In the year 2015, the Brazilian Center for the Monitoring of Disasters, CEMADEM, they published a report together with IBGE, the Brazilian Statistics and Geography's Office, where they map all the areas in the country which are prone to landslides and natural disasters. Now that the new population census from 2022 is being published, we hope that this study will be updated sometime soon. We don't know yet when. But even with the 2015 study that we had, if you look at the map of the areas that were prone to landslides and natural disasters in Rio Grande do Sul, they were not even close to the tragedy that we saw, because the floodings and the rainfall was so extreme that those models couldn't predict. And I guess it's part of the black swan effect, that it's very hard to predict such extreme events like this. But I agree with you, we do have lots of information and data in Brazil compared to other countries. And it's a real shame that governments still look at the short term for their fiscal constraints and not so much in the long run about the lives they could be saving.
Obrigada, Rafael. Professor.
Just adding something to what Rafael answered to Ottaviano, the issue of short term, all the question of resilience and of response to shocks is led to the executive power. That was one of the findings of the study of this group of financial resilience, that one need to mobilize the legislative, city council, because they say it's a problem with the mayor. I don't have anything to do with that. And things we have to open the space and not only make pressure on the mayor from society or from press, but we have to mobilize other elements, I think, is part of this conversation, but especially, and this group did that, going to some of the city councils to bring this message, not only short-term responses, but long-term, etc., etc.
Maybe just one more for the lady who asked about countries addressing climate through nuclear weapons and technology. And I think that we don't particularly have that answer exactly, but countries tend to put resources behind what they feel is priority for in internal matters. I'm not saying that climate change is not a priority for countries, but often they tend to fuel what is either politically correct or, you know, what they would like to direct resources to. In the case of Africa, some Sahel countries, some West African countries, they often put majority of their resources into peace and security, where climate is you know, taken a secondary fiscal spend. But my feeling is that the more you put your money to, the more you often fueling it. And we are living in a circular economy where, as you try to offset one, another is impacted. So also in terms of the consultation that governments have, often they are either supported in spending their, you know, resources in a specific area, but often there's a lot of pushback because it can cause more harm than good. So I think that's from the perspective that I work in. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
No, just one supplemental observation on this short term and the long term, and this phenomena is classical for any country and any city. And I closely interact with the city mayors, and they are visionary, and they wanted to invest long. And usually this project cycle of infrastructure is about 10 to 15 years. And if you invest and you get the returns of the 15 years. But if you look at the electoral cycle of the mayor, and it is 5 years, and he cannot plan or he cannot vision beyond that first 5-year term. And the third thing is the fiscal capacity of the cities are very limited, and they need to look into the central government for their budget outlays, which is annual. So you have an annual cycle, and you have a 5-year electoral cycle, and you have a long-term need. That is where most of the mismatch or that kind of a maladaptation is taking place, and that is first. And the disaster, and here I think we need to be specific when we define the disasters. We have the natural disasters, and like earthquake and typhoons that comes, and some of them are climate induced, some of them are natural, and we need to differentiate. And the second is these industrial disasters, and that is happening at the factory level or the country level. And second thing is what is happening in Ukraine, and this is all these two categories are man-made disasters. And so here we have a natural disaster, man-made disasters, and then climate-induced disasters. And often our discussions or the debates we club together, and here I think we need much more specific, and the interventions are needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Acho que a gente conseguiu cumprir o nosso prazo, né? Então, acho que, em resumo, a gente tem, para que a gente tenha uma inovação para cidades resilientes, o pacto federativo é cada vez mais importante, né? Isso está claro para todos, em todos os exemplos que a gente teve aqui hoje, e também os transnacionais, né? Acho que as ações de cooperação do Sul Global vão ser muito importantes para essas trocas. A gente precisa oportunizar melhor essa cooperação, o fortalecimento institucional, né, dessas organizações, para que deem conta, né, desse novo momento que a gente está vivendo, e não só do enfrentamento das mudanças climáticas, né, mas também tecnológicas e outras que estão vindo por aí. Então, agradeço a todos os painelistas, né? E agora, a professora Ana Célia está convidando todos para um café aqui ao lado. Obrigada a todos, gente.